Okay, thank you very much. I'm about to present 5 opportunities for building resilience, and I'm standing here feeling quite humbled by the discussion I heard at my table, the kind of stories, the individual stories about people's experience with shocks and stresses in the world. And we had 6 at our table, and every single person had a significant encounter or experience with a shock or a stress that had significant impacts on their community. And so what I'd like to do is talk not about all of the ways that we can address the problem of shocks and stresses or give you a compendium of resilience building tools, but just explore 5 approaches. So the question to answer is, so how do we increase the resilience capacity of our communities and cities? And I think there's a number of areas for building resilience. These, again, there are 10 of them as it turns out. I think there's probably more, but these are the 10 big ones I think that are going to be important for us as community leaders, designers and planners and so forth. One is public health. The area of public health is going to be critical to building resilience in communities. Education and training will be very important. Governance, effective governance is a key criteria for building and maintaining resilience. Obviously, the community and city's economy is going to be very important. A healthy economy immediately is a more resilient economy or a city or a community than one with a dysfunctioning economy. Justice, public order, and security. Often these are the things talked about when people talk about resilience, resilience to emergencies and so forth, but they are important. Building, fabric, and transportation, the kind of shocks and stresses, the environmental ones like weather events and so forth, are going to be having some real impact on building, fabric, and transportation, so building, hardening, and so forth will be important. Energy infrastructure is critical to the functioning of our communities and economies. Food production infrastructure is key, and communications and information technology infrastructure, new in the last 10 years, but becoming absolutely essential for the functioning of our economies and culture, and then of course water and waste infrastructure. So what I'd like to do is explore just 5 of these. Let me get a glass of water here. These are not the only ones or the most important ones, but they're ones that in our studio we've been exploring as approaches that we think will add a lot to the resilience of cities and in many cases communities that make up the cities. So the first one raised by one of our participants at my first presentation is growth and density. A lot of people think growth and density is a bad thing. But it's actually a very, very, in fact, I think one of the most important resilience building approaches that we have. So if you were one of those people that think density is bad or growth of a city or community is bad, I would ask you to think again. And here's why. First of all, population and immigration are things that we're going to be experiencing in the next 25 years the way we've never experienced before. 50% of the world's populations now live in cities. By 2050, 70 to 80% of the population will live in cities. For 2 reasons. One is population growth itself within the cities, and the other is what Doug Saunders calls, the writer of the book called Arrival Cities, calls the 3rd Great Migration. And this is the migration of rural peoples into cities. So like it or not, cities are going to become more populous and, if they're smart, denser. So there are 2 very, very good things about this situation. I think a lot of people fear population growth and density, but there are 2 very good things, and here's what they are. First of all, a biologist by the name of Kleiber at the turn of the last century was studying metabolism of animals, of mammals, and found that the larger the animal, the greater the mass of an animal, the lower its metabolic rate. And the metabolic rate is the rate at which the animal processes food, the energy it expends per gram. And it's not only lower, but it follows what power law, the square root of the square root, so that the larger the animal, the lower the metabolic rate. Well, that's very interesting if you're a biologist. But interestingly, in the 1990s, a physicist by the name of Geoffrey West came along and started to see if this rule applied to anything else. And it turns out that it does. It applies to cities. That a city's metabolic rate, in other words, how much energy it burns per capita, how much road it lays down per capita, how much pipe it has to manufacture per capita, all the things that burn energy and burn resources, the rate of burn goes down exponentially with the size of the city. That's very, very important. It means the larger and denser your city, the less per capita energy is consumed and materials are used. So in terms of resource efficiency and effectiveness, the bigger the city, the denser the city, the better. So here's the second very compelling thing about this. West then went on to say, well, are there any other relationships that have to do with city size? And it turns out that as you increase the size of a city, you get an exponential growth in innovation. So that's why you see the biggest cities in the world tending to produce the most inventions, the latest music, the latest art. West measured, for his measure, he took patents, and he measured patents in all the cities across the United States. And as you increase the city size, you increase the number of patents exponentially. So that means that as cities expand in size, they're going to be reducing the amount of energy per capita that they use, which is good, because think about energy is also, in our present world, carbon. So our carbon footprint per capita goes down with large cities. And when we're coming into a time of great stress, where resilience will be needed, isn't it better that we're more innovative than not? So how do we get there? I think high-rise density is something that we're going to have to learn how to do very well. I think New York City and Vancouver are great examples in North America how to do this. I think as we start to transform our suburbs into denser habitation, that transit-oriented design is going to be an important strategy. And one of the most important questions is how less dense can we be and still be dense? And that means what kind of density really will allow for the kind of efficiencies and sustainable kinds of infrastructure like LRTs and really good public transit. And there's a real discussion right now in planning circles about this, but somewhere in the order of 50 to 60 dwelling units per hectare is the kind of density that makes sense. And those are the densities that were around in the early 1920s and 30s for streetcar suburbs. Now, what's really interesting about this is that a writer by the name of Ed Glazer, a Harvard economist, who just finished writing a book called The Triumph of the City, which is really a great read, gave a sense of the kind of capacity that this would produce. If you took all of the people in the world, you could put all the people in the world in the state of Texas in that kind of habitation. So density is something that we want to look at as a tool for dealing with population. I've got 20 minutes? Okay, that's not too bad. Local low-carbon energy. Why? Well, first of all, energy demand's going up. So as the countries like China and India continue to increase their economic output, they'll be demanding more and more energy. North America will continue to demand a lot of energy. So we are going to be wanting to look at finding solutions to our problem with CO2. So low carbon energy is going to be key. Second of all, we have a problem right now with our electrical power infrastructure in North America, most of it North America, Manitoba being an exception. We're going to be looking for ways to make or build on existing infrastructure, redevelop infrastructure, and as we do, we're going to want to make it a low-carbon infrastructure. And why? Because not only is pumping CO2 into the atmosphere a bad thing, as we move forward, there's a very good chance that carbon taxation and some accounting of carbon will be kicking in. So communities that start to build low-carbon energy sources will probably have a better chance down the road of being economically successful and resilient than those that don't. So how do we do it? Well, the first really good piece of news is that zero-carbon energy is nearing net parity. And by net parity, I mean the cost of coal is the bottom line. If we can't get zero-carbon energy below the cost of coal, the game is over. Because coal is very, very cheap per kilowatt hour, about 90 cents. And as a result, no city nor community is going to move away from that if they have to pay a lot more for it. But right now, PV, photovoltaics, is somewhere around 5 years away from net parity. That's not too bad. You've got a sort of a comparison of various costs here. Conventional coal being $100 per megawatt, and PV getting down to that over the next 5 years. But the problem with both PV and wind is the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. And storing the power for that intermittent phenomena is very important. And up until now, there really hasn't been much in the way of battery technology that's going to work. But right now, there is, over the next 5-10 years, the explorations of liquid metal batteries is one example. There are a couple of others that will actually boost the power density of batteries by the power of 10. So that means that all of a sudden we will be able to harness the energy and store it from PV and wind power in an economically effective way. But I think more important and most controversial is nuclear power. How many of you have some ambivalence about nuclear power? Hands up. Okay. So you probably should. The nuclear power of the past was based on uranium, and uranium had two goals. One was to produce power, but the other was to produce plutonium so we could make atom bombs and hydrogen bombs in the Cold War. Well, there was this is a nuclear plant in China, a CANDU plant, using Canadian technology that our country really isn't pursuing anymore, but China certainly is, as is India, because it is starting, or they are starting to use thorium nuclear. And thorium, unlike uranium, is much richer in energy and also much less expensive, and the waste products from it are much less harmful. They have half-lives of in the hundreds of years as opposed to thousands of years, and it's very, very difficult to make nuclear weapons from them. That's why the Allies in the Second World War stayed away from it, because it was too difficult to make a bomb out of thorium, whereas you could process uranium to make plutonium very easily. So here's the kind of metrics that there are. A ton of thorium can produce as much energy as 200 tons of uranium, or 3.5 million tons of coal. And this kind of power, over probably the next 5 to 10 years, has the potential to meet or go below the cost of coal. And if fourth-generation nuclear, and this is one of a couple of types of fourth-generation nuclear, is real, it is probably the answer to our carbon problem. Much as it's very controversial, I think it's something you want to consider in the future when you hear about it. The third one is local food production. Why do we want to consider local food production? Because as we increase the number of people on the planet and potentially decrease the number of arable acres of land on the planet, we're going to have to look for solutions to food. Also, as we face disruptions in potentially in transportation and power supply and so forth, we're going to want to build resilience into our local food supply systems. Because to survive, we need two things. We need water and we need food. So making sure that our communities and cities have some sort of resilient food supply is very important. This doesn't mean growing all of our own food in the city, but basically having a resilient food supply. So remember the Hadley cells. This is going to be one of the main culprits of causing food shocks and stresses in the future. And so we're going to want to look at how to build resilience to that. So how do we do it? Well, right across North America right now, there is a debate going on in municipalities about whether or not you can have chickens in your backyard. In your municipality, do you have the chicken debate going on? Hands up. Yeah, okay, everywhere. Whether or not you are going to be allowed to have chickens in your backyard is really not going to solve the problem of local food. It's simply not scalable. You get one egg per chicken per day, unless things get fouled up, and then you have less. So it just doesn't scale. The reality is that the amount of land required, typical arable land, per person in North America is about 2 acres per person for an omnivore. It's less for vegetarians. In Toronto, that means 6 million acres. We don't have 6 million acres of land in Toronto, and most cities right now have paved over their arable land to put up suburbs. And in Canada, at least, we have winter, so we have 6 months of the year where we can't grow anything anyway. So what do we do? Well, I think a solution or a strategy that cities are going to want to explore and communities are going to want to explore is vertical food production. In fact, we have in the room Gordon Graff over there. He's one of the world's experts in vertical food production. And what this talks about, and this is his idea for how you could, on a very large scale in a city, have integration with food distribution and food production. And what it's all about is basically hydroponic food production. The efficiency of this kind of food is 50 times the level of land food production. So for every meter of hydroponic floor plate here, you would have to have 50 square meters of typical arable land. So this will be something that will be very important as we move into the future and start to lose arable land around the planet, and our population goes up. I suspect that this will be one of the most important strategies for dealing with that relationship of decreasing number of arable land acres and increasing population of the planet. And this isn't pie in the sky stuff. The United States Navy was doing this in the 50s in the Pacific, where their supply lines for supplying their troops with food were stretched. So they set up in the Philippines various warehouses where they grew food hydroponically. Very efficient. The technology's there. We know how to do it. What Gordon came up with was a very interesting, intriguing strategy where you integrate the production of food with your processing of black water waste to provide nutrients and energy so that you're not wasting anything. It makes for an extremely efficient system of food production. So the fourth one that we're exploring is the modularization and CIT integration of key infrastructure systems. What does that mean? And first of all, why? Well, first of all, the key infrastructure systems are electrical systems and waste systems and water systems. And back in Toronto on August 14, 2003, and across the northeast United States and parts of Quebec, was plunged into darkness for about, I think, 3 to 5 days, somewhere in that order. One of the largest power outages in the history of North America. 10 million people in Canada affected, 45 million people in the United States affected. And what it spoke to is the fragility of our North American, or at least American-Canadian power grids, and how you can have one small incident happen in one city and have a cascading series of failures. So I think building resilience into our grids is going to be very important. There are some opportunities for doing this. As another example, just recently in the United States of storms cutting through a number of communities and taking out power. So how will those communities respond, and are they resilient to that kind of impact? So how are we going to do it? Well, first of all, one thing to keep in mind in all of our discussions is Moore's Law. Gordon Moore was one of the founders of Intel, and he started to see over the years that as they developed technology that it was following an exponential path of efficiency in terms of how many integrated circuits you could put on a square inch of chip. And basically, the number of circuits you could put on doubled every 2 years. So that's an exponential growth. And a lot of other things in our technical economy are following the same power rule. Our world right now, our technical world, is an exponential world. So typically, human beings tend to think arithmetically. When you think, I'm going to walk 10 steps, you know that in 10 steps I'm going to be here. But 10 steps exponentially, I'm going to be over there. But our minds tend to think arithmetically. This is very important because it starts to speak at how fast changes will happen, both positive changes and potentially negative changes. Has anyone seen this image before? Yep. It's Facebook. Facebook was founded in 2004. Today, it has 800 million subscribers. That picture is a map of the light is all the dots, individual dots of white of people connecting to Facebook. And you can see that it maps out the United States and a little bit of the bottom of Canada because Canada's really just a thin ribbon along the top of the United States, and the edge of Central and South America, Europe, a bit of the edges of Africa, and then into China's almost gone because, of course, it's cut off from the rest of the internet. But the point of showing you this is to say how fast technology is growing in its acceptance and also how it integrates itself into our lives. How many people aren't on Facebook? Well, you probably won't put up your hands anyway. So that's interesting. That's the internet. Anyone heard of the Internet of Things? The Internet of Things is sort of the next bizarre step in connectivity. The Internet of Things is the connection of various things to one another, communicating through Wi-Fi with one another, and God knows for what purpose and why. But just like the internet, it had a very simple purpose, and today it's about Facebook. But here's how things will connect. This is a radio frequency identification device. You pass a scanner over it, and that little wee chip there that's just larger than the size of a grain of rice, you can see it. That's the palm of a hand there, and that little white thing is a grain of rice. These things, when you pass a scanner over them, a little electromagnetic radiation shines down on it, it lights it up, and it says, I'm a little RFID that is about the door of the car closing. Who knows? But in, say, 5 or 10 years, these things will actually have a little computer chip in them, and they'll be communicating with other things, so that maybe it's in my clothing, or maybe it's in chairs or cars or whatever, and as things connect to one another, they'll be telling each other that they're there. I walk into a building, 20 of us walk into a room, and all of a sudden the room knows we're there, and it can adjust the temperature of the room. So that's just my sort of prediction off the top of my head, but imagine the things that we haven't thought that these are doing. A lot of people are actually quite worried about the kind of control and security issues associated with these. But nevertheless, worry or not, it's happening, it's coming. So how does this have to do with resilience of cities? Well, one thing it has to do with resilience of cities is that we talk about smart grids, and this is a typical network diagram of smart grid that industry with power generation sources and that could contribute to the grid, solar power, wind power, hydropower, nuclear power, whatever, feeding onto the grid, connecting together in a way that makes sense. A way that says, I've got some extra supply of power here I can supply into the grid. I need some power. And so you've got all of those things connecting to one another. Well, that's pretty straightforward. I mean, it's not straightforward to implement, but that's a basic understanding. But what about a grid that is the Internet of all things? When you start to understand that it could be more than that, it could also be about how much food is being consumed. With RFID, you could know that so many bushels of tomatoes were being processed. You actually know that now through scanning at the checkout. And that could feed into the amount of understanding what kind of sewage was being produced and the amount of water required and what kind of power was required for that. So all of these things can start to be integrated. And why this is important to think about is A, the cost for doing this is coming down exponentially. The actual availability of this technology is increasing exponentially, and it poses the opportunity to create resilience in our systems that will allow systems, remember I talked about being decentralized and being flexible? Well, what happens if part of a system collapses or is affected by some sort of stress or shock? Another part of the system may be able to pick up for that piece that is affected. And then the other aspect of looking at our infrastructure being more resilient is modularization. And this is a diagram that we drew for a resilience strategy that the city of Edmonton asked us to prepare for them, which was how do they make their city more resilient with existing technology? How am I doing for time? 3 minutes. But modularization meaning if you modularize power and waste and water supply, if one area of the city is affected, the other areas aren't affected, and they can help that area that is affected. Infrastructure hardening, why? Well, so what happens when this is Katrina, or this hits this, or this? Well, you're going to get this, as you know, or you're going to get this. And the frequency of weather events is increasing. When I went into architecture school in 1980, there were 4 of them in the world. When I gave my first presentation on resilience in 2008, there were 40. The number and intensity of severe weather events is increasing. So we have to start to look at how we're going to build or harden our infrastructure to that. And how are we doing it? Well, one is physical infrastructure hardening. For example, look at what they're doing right now in New Orleans with the new dike systems. We can learn from the past. I mean, lessons about how to build a building fabric in a resilient way is key. Currently, we're going to have to look at more sophisticated techniques for hardening buildings. Integrated durability buildings are created of many different parts, and how they integrate will be important. And then learning from the present. We are dealing with, for example, greater possibility of windstorms and water storms. We now start to, when we're designing, model these and actually take them into account and build resilience in the fabric as we go. For example, building additional weather protection for existing buildings or new buildings. There's some shuttering devices that we're exploring. So summary, key opportunities for building resilience: public health, education and training, governance, economy, justice, building fabric, transportation, energy infrastructure, food production infrastructure, CIT infrastructure, and water and waste infrastructure. And the 5 approaches: increase urban size and density, probably the most important one, low carbon energy production, local urban food production, modularization and integration of CIT infrastructure, and infrastructure building and fabric hardening. That's it. Any questions?
Thank you, Craig. Maybe we can take just a few minutes of questions. I think we have one over there. If we can just wait for the microphone to arrive to you.
Thank you. I have not seen it. Mine is a question about what you said of this publication that puts all the population of the world in the state of Texas, and it gets the density that has been considered as ideal. And I would like to know, are you implying that the world is not enough populated yet? Or, I mean, I'm
No.
concerned, that really concerns me, because this statement might be interpreted as there's still room enough for us to grow in terms of population, and I would not share that point of view, because I think that if you think in ecological footprint, we do not occupy just the area we are stepping in, but we are depending in a so much larger area for getting the food we need, the energy, the clothing, the medicine. So I would like to hear a little more of the reason why you share with us this example. If you mind.
Thank you very much for the question. It's a really good question. It's an important question. First of all, I wasn't implying we should move everyone to Texas. First of all, it wouldn't be a great place for everyone to live, and they wouldn't appreciate it. But but all kidding aside, the question is density and population size actually possible, given the impact that it has, irrespective of creating density in a city, irrespective, there will be impact as that city reaches out to grab resources and bring them to the city. Yes, that is a problem. But the reality is we have 2 billion people that we are going to be adding to the planet in the next 25 years. Like, that's tomorrow. That's half a lifetime. So if we're going to be adding those people to the planet, what's the best way to do it? Not the best way that will solve all problems or have no problems, but if we're going to find the least problematic way to do it, what is it? And I think it is by inhabiting populous places, increasing the density of existing cities. New cities may spring up. They certainly will be springing up in China and India and Africa. So how do we inhabit the planet least impactfully? And that is, I think, by inhabiting them in cities, because cities have the least per capita demand on our planet of any habitation. It doesn't mean that there isn't going to be increased demand by all those people, but it will be the least impactful way that we can live on the planet. Then the question is, how do we start to pull in other impacts that we're now, negative impacts we're having on the environment? And one of the other ways to do it is local food. If we start to decrease, many slides cut out from this presentation, but when you think of all the deforestation that's going on in the Amazon, or rainforests around the world for that matter, because of farming, people are cutting rainforests in order to farm. Well, if we can start to look at growing enough food for ourselves in cities, we don't have that as a species, that same negative impact on the environment that farming does. That's a huge one. If we're starting to reduce the amount of energy that we need by mining coal, huge damage to the environment through mining coal. So that is another strategy. So we're trying to find resilient strategies, but also all of these strategies are also, I think, environmentally responsible strategies. That again, we hold the fort with resilience, but we're trying to get to a future state where we can actually inhabit the planet, that 9 billion of us, in a way that is going to be sustainable. If we can't find it, then we all know the problems we're facing. The shocks and stress continue to multiply in intensity and frequency. So.
Thank you, Craig. We have time for one more very quick question and one more very quick response from Craig. So if we could take it from this gentleman over here. And by the way, Craig will be here over the next 2 days. You will have lots of opportunity to find him and discuss and have questions with him then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Hans Kerman, and I will probably just add to the approaches ecosystem resiliency, building ecosystem resiliency, because at the end of the day, This is also a problem of scales, in which trying to build resilience at the socioeconomic level may be in conflict to building resilience at the ecosystem level, which is providing the supporting, the life supporting systems that we require. So one of the beauty of the definitions that you put forward at the first presentations was the holistic nature of resiliency. And the presentation right now, it's kind of looking at cities in a bubble. And that's an artificial construct.
That's as much a comment as a question, but you're right. I think ecosystem resilience, or the reality that we are not separate from the ecosystem. Cities are part of an ecosystem, create their own ecosystem, are integrally connected to their surrounding environment. And how we integrate with the environment is absolutely essential to building resilience. Because if ecosystems fail, they're the things that produce all of the natural services that we need. They produce the oxygen, they produce the pollination, they produce the micronutrients and so forth. If they fail, we fail. So absolutely right. The poverty of this presentation stems from time, I suspect, and from a willingness to embrace all of the possibilities for resilience. These are not set up. Please don't misunderstand me. These 5 were not set up as the most important 5, except I think number 1 is very, very important. But 5 that we're exploring that have real impact. But you're absolutely right. Ecosystem resilience and our ability to cohabit with ecosystems is very, very important to building resilience. Thank you.